Welcome to Pop Psych 101
where we, licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad,
and licensed psychologist Dr. Hayley Roberts
break down and analyze how mental health is represented in movies, shows, books, and across the pop culture and social media landscape.
We will determine what lines up with real life and what is just pop culture fantasy.
This is Pop Psych 101. Welcome back to Pop Psych 101. I am licensed therapist Ryan Engelstad, here as always with my co-host, Dr. Hayley Roberts.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Hayley, and welcome back. We are very excited to be talking about a show, I think, that was written for us.
I think so.
Someone at Apple TV listens to the podcast and was like, Hayley and Ryan need a show that is just so specific to their tastes and their conversations that they will have 10 episodes of stuff to talk about.
I agree.
So if that wasn't enough of a hint, we're going to be talking about Apple TV's shrinking today and answering questions like, why is self-disclosure sometimes unethical if you let a patient live in your back house?
Oh my goodness.
I think that needs a different term other than self-disclosure.
Dual relationships.
Yeah, there you go. But before that, Hayley, there's a lot of stuff going on in the news that feels somewhat relevant to our industry, and that is artificial intelligence. I don't know if you've been following along with all the chat GPT stuff and all these chat bots and all the intelligence that they have. As you can imagine, it's something I'm very curious in, and I've been playing around with the last couple of weeks. Of things have been getting more interesting. First of all, so is that something that interests you? Are you into the artificial intelligence stuff? Do you play around with any of these things at all?
I don't play around with any of it.
Okay.
It's something that I'm like, oh, I should try that out. And then it never goes further than a thought of like, oh, that seems curious. Yeah, I find it interesting, like I find it intriguing that we are kind of forming this new realm of technology that can aggregate data in a realistic-ish way. And it's intriguing to see probably like where it will go. Cause like the ones where they like take photos of people and then create like a photo of that person, the hands are always weird. There's always like 9 fingers.
Well, they're working on it. Yes.
So like they're not quite at a place where like to me it's whoa.
Where it would trick you or yeah, sure. Yeah.
But I think things like deep fakes and stuff like that are becoming more and more possible. Like I think that's a little like scary of what can be possible with stuff like that.
Well, yeah, in terms of what's possible, I mean, a lot of like the natural questions that people ask as these things continue to evolve is like, whose jobs are at risk, right? What's being replaced? What machines are going to take over what tasks and things like that? And you'll be happy to know one of the things that somebody actually asked ChatGPT recently, like, what jobs do you think you,
Try it again.
All right. What jobs do you, ChatGPT, do you not think you are going to be able to replace? And the artificial intelligence bot said, doctors, nurses, therapists were also up there.
Okay.
And I think you and I could sort of intuit sort of why that would be. We were talking before we started recording. I think there are a lot of things that even if a chat bot could replicate the words we might say to some extent, that something would be missing from that people would not really be benefiting from, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think until, let's just say, robots, right, or AI become completely indistinguishable from humans.
Yep.
It truly like a deep fake of me and me can both talk and nobody can tell which one's me and which one's the deep fake. Until that happens, I think there's just something about the connection with another human vibe or soul or presence that is imperative to therapy. And currently, like when I am like on my bank's website and I'm like chatting with something and it's chatting with a bot that's giving me all the answers, I'm like
Yeah.
grateful that I get all of the answers.
Sure.
But at the end of it, it feels different that if I feel like I'm chatting with a person and they have helped me.
Yeah.
I get the same result out of both of them. But at the end of like with the person, I'm like, thank you so much for all your help. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
And there is something about human connection that is so central to the human soul. And I think that that is necessary for therapy to be, I don't know, to feel seen, I
Well, right,
think.
because it's the live interaction nature of it as well.
Mhm.
Because I've seen text chat therapy and things like
Mhm.
that, and I've used some of these bots, some of them of which are designed explicitly to act as a therapist or act as
Uh-huh.
a compassionate robot companion, whatever it might be. And it's some of it's very impressive. You could say I'm feeling this way or feeling that way, and you could be fooled into thinking that a human is typing these words back to you.
Okay.
Um, but when it's just these words and the things that, because I think that's sort of what it's good for. It's like, hey, oh, I'm feeling anxious today. It can spit back out skills that you could practice,
Yeah.
or it could type out, reassuring, reflective statements
Platitudes.
for you
Yeah.
to
Uh-huh.
for you to think about. But something about seeing a person, even virtually, because we'll probably talk about this in the episode today, but um, seeing a person even virtually on a screen is a step beyond that, where not only are you hearing the words being said, but there is some visual connection. Like this person is with me in this moment
Yeah.
and understands me beyond just telling me to meditate, or whatever a chatbot would
Yeah.
tell you to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also think that like what came to my mind is probably about a year ago or so, you and I decided we were going to go from just audio when we were recording
Yeah.
to having the video on. And we both kind of said, like, oh, being able to like see the other person's engagement with what they're saying actually made it an easier process for us and a more connected process for us. And I think that's a perfect example
Yep.
of that. And like I hope if we ever do get replaced by computers, I hope that like what you can choose, like I hope you can choose personality types for your therapist, right? Because like today one of my teenagers said something and I just went like, dude, that blows. And like I don't think any algorithm is ever going to have dude that blows
I think you're
as
probably right.
as a therapeutic response.
Hmm.
But for that teenager, that's exactly what they needed to hear today.
Yeah.
And so like I hope one day it'll be like, be more casual or like have a sense of humor or
Yeah.
use metaphors or
Hmm.
like
Yep.
hopefully you can choose that. Yeah. I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see. I mean, you can, if you go into the Bing website, you can say like precise, creative, or balanced. So they're exploring that space to a certain degree. So it's all
Great.
very interesting. I have no desire to be replaced, but I'm also fascinated by the possibility. So
Mhm.
I'll be sure to keep you up to date.
Yeah. I'm also
As the
thinking that like you and I are going to age out of this job before we're fully replaced
Well, that would
anyway,
be
so.
nice. I don't wanna have to worry about it. Let the next generation of therapists worry
Yeah.
about that problem. Yeah. All right.
That's what
Well, we're
everybody wants, the aging
yeah.
people to be like,
Yeah.
"That's the kid's problem."
Yes, yes, yes. Well, someday our homework will be, well, go talk to your AI bot and
Mhm.
and, maybe you'll
Yeah.
feel better
Which of
about
my
as
AI
well.
bots would you like to
Yes,
speak to
yes.
next week?
Yes. All right. So, let's take a quick break here, and listen to an ad that we have for you, and then we'll come back and talk about Apple TV's shrinking.
Hey, Ryan, let's chat a little bit about making podcasts. You and I have kind of talked a bit with our listeners in previous episodes and things like that about how we got started and what this journey in creating this podcast has been like for us. And now we've got an ad that can maybe help some of our listeners if they're interested in starting their own podcast.
Yeah, and Hayley, when I first started this podcast a long time ago, it was super complicated. But the great thing that we have now, which is Spotify. Spotify's got a platform that lets you make a podcast super easily and then distribute it everywhere and even
Mm-hmm.
earn money all in one place for free. So it's called Spotify for Podcasts, and this is how it works. Basically, Spotify for Podcasts let you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard.
You also have the option to make video podcasts, when you really want to take those conversations to the next level, to get your fans involved. You can use Q&As and polls to really get them invested in the conversation about your podcast. So it's Spotify for podcasters. You can also earn money in a variety of ways, including creating podcast subscriptions or including ads. And I think the best of all, and something that you and I have both found very helpful, is that it's totally free without any catch and lets you get your podcast out there.
Yeah, and we highly recommend that you give this a try. Being able to do this podcast for us the last couple of years has been such a joy, and now it's easier than ever. So download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started today.
And enjoy making your podcast.
Pop Psych 101 discusses mental health as it is portrayed in pop culture media, and because of this, we often cover sensitive topics that can be triggering for some listeners.
We also delve into the characters and plots of these stories, and therefore, spoilers abound.
So please, use your discretion as you listen to the rest of the episode. Shrinking is an American comedy drama television series created by Bill Lawrence, Jason Segel, and Brett Goldstein. It premiered on January 27th, 2023 on Apple TV, and it stars Jason Segel as Jimmy Laird, who is a therapist dealing with severe grief, and he begins to breach ethical barriers by telling his patients what he really thinks, resulting in massive changes to his and their lives. So, Hayley, at any point, because the first episode really kind of jumps into like to Jimmy's decision to, I just want to shake things up. I just want to, he wants to help his patients move on. The whole vibe of that like montage that we see is, from Jimmy's point of view, his patients sort of telling him the same thing that they always tell him. And he wants to shake them out of that. He wants to see progress, and probably because of his own stuckness.
Like he wants to shake himself a bit.
Exactly. He decides that he wants to tell his patients what he really thinks, despite his supervisor's suggestions to the contrary. Do you ever share this desire to, quote unquote, tell your patients what you really think?
The desire, sure. Yeah, I'm human. I have opinions about people's choices.
Yes, of course.
I very rarely tell my patients what to do unless I feel as though there's a little bit of like, hey, like, I think it might be a very good idea to tell your mom that this is going on. Or like, have you considered asking your spouse for help with this? It seems as though they might be somebody that might have good insight into what to do. And to be totally honest, like, it kind of takes a lot for me to even be that direct about it.
Like, that's a big deal. That's a relationship tester. Yep.
Yeah. And then I always preface it with, and of course, if you decide that that doesn't make sense for you, you don't want to do it, it doesn't fit in with your understanding of yourself and your values, certainly do not do it.
Totally fine. Yeah.
And then sometimes I will give like here's why I think that it might be a good idea. Your mom has showed that she is like steps up in situations like this, and you're feeling that you can't make a decision. Let somebody else make that decision for you, and why not have it be your mom, right? Stuff like that.
Yeah, because the examples that we see, right? He tells one of his patients that she should leave her husband, right? Grace, right? And
Mhm.
then she does, and then all this happens in the first 2 episodes. She moves in with her sister, and she's doing so good, and he's so happy for her. And of course, that leads to unforeseen consequences. With Sean,
Takes him to the
he
MMA gym.
yeah. So, and there are some of these examples that I want to dig in with you because I think there's sort of a spectrum of the sort of problematic nature of some of his
Mhm.
interventions, some of which are quite problematic, some
Mhm.
of which I think are actually really interesting, especially for people who have not been into therapy. I could see them asking, like, why couldn't my therapist come with me to spread my mom's ashes, as he
Mhm.
does with one patient later on in the
Mhm.
season?
Mhm.
Why couldn't my therapist, if we talked about wanting to go to an MMA gym, like, why couldn't he come with me the first day?
Mhm.
So we called out, especially that example with Sean. What's your thought on those sort of experiential interventions?
I'm all for it as
Okay.
long as it, like, makes sense for the therapy itself.
Yeah.
For me, who's 100% remote, it would take a lot for me to, like, change that whole dynamic.
Yeah.
However, I think that, like, if you are a therapist who sees your patient in person
Hmm.
every single week, and you determine, okay, you need support scattering your mother's ashes, great.
Let's go do it.
Why
Yeah.
don't we schedule a time that will be your session for the week, and that's what we
Hmm.
will do for that session.
Yeah.
Some people may think that, like, and this is, like, really, inside baseball, but there might be insurance stuff or malpractice insurance type stuff, or
Sure.
coverage, things like that. But
Yes.
that depends on each individual therapist and the
Hmm.
work that they do.
Yep.
But I actually think that, like, so my note for "Let's go find you someone to beat up" is what,
Yes.
Jimmy
Yes.
says to Sean.
Yes.
I was like, "Yeah, I think that's great." Like, if a kid starts hitting kids in his class, sign him up for karate.
Yep.
Teach him how to, like, appropriately manage his body in an appropriate way, right?
Hmm.
And I feel like that's, like, a socially acceptable, appropriate outlet.
Yeah.
They mention in the show, like, "This is so unethical." I disagree. Now, there is a line where he says, "My therapist forced me to fight a guy." Now,
Yes.
if that's what happened,
Right. That's
that is
different.
unethical.
Yep. Yep.
But I think this specific therapy session in and of itself was not unethical. It is when his and Sean's boundaries start getting bent. And, he starts self disclosing, and then it just kind of snowballs from there. So,
Hmm.
but truly, as like like he goes into the woman who has OCD tendencies. He goes into her home to do some, like,
Yeah.
exposure therapy. That's
Hmm.
okay, right? Like, there's plenty of therapists who are
Yep.
do in-home treatment.
Absolutely.
And I think taking the man to go scatter his mother's ashes, I also think that that's okay.
Hmm.
Telling Grace to leave her husband, not okay.
Right.
Because that's a
Right.
decision about her life rather
Yes.
than supporting a process
Right.
in the therapy,
Yeah.
quote unquote, room.
Yeah, well, so I think that's a good distinction, a good call out because, some of these experiential things, I think there's a world in which all of that is actually really helpful to his patients. And there's various montages. He has the patient that like has issues dating and they kind of
Mhm.
go out to dinner and, kind of, I saw in one of your notes, you wish you could observe your patients in
In
real
real
life.
life? Oh my
And
gosh,
I
yeah.
the same. I think because that in the moment my symptoms are happening right now or my dysfunctional
Uh-huh,
relationship dynamics are happening right now,
uh-huh.
and to be able to identify those in the moment, process them with someone who's working with you on these issues in the moment,
Mhm,
and make different choices, I think is so powerful
mhm,
that if that's available in the context of therapy that the therapist is doing, that I think that's great.
mhm,
And I do think it's very feasible that you could get really good outcomes from that.
mhm,
But, on the other end of the spectrum is where Jimmy ends up in multiple instances as well.
mhm.
And not just because the OCD patient, tries to kiss him, right?
Uh-huh.
Sean moves in with him. Obviously, the patient who he tells to leave her husband, Grace. The husband
beats him up,
finds out and tracks him down and beats him up. And then his other patient comes in and defends him. So it's like, as soon as you open yourself up to your life kind of being enmeshed with your patients' lives, like now we're talking unethical and dangerous, not just to your patients, but to your own sort of sense of self and lifestyle as well.
Yeah. Like, I think Grace and the woman with OCD and then the man with his grief around his mother, individually, each of those, I think, can be like argued of like what and how was therapeutic about this, what and how was meaningful. Sean, absolutely not. Like there's no way to be like, oh yeah, this whole relationship was totally fine.
Yeah.
And then it doubly gets complicated where there's like a sort of half thing between Sean and his daughter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a tough it's a tough thing.
Well, yeah, and that's, and I for me, I was glad that we got from these sort of like unethical therapist interventions into just like Jimmy's life, right? And the different relationships that were going on for him, because I think that sort of re-emphasis over the course of those first couple of episodes really brought us into, okay, here's what's actually going on. Like this person is suffering from prolonged grief, and it's affecting him, it's affecting his daughter, it's affecting his relationships, he's disconnected from people, and that is on its own a big explanation for why he's sort of desperate to initiate radical change in other people's lives.
Yeah. Well, and it almost feels a little bit like he's because he knows it's not really the appropriate take. And so like, it almost feels like he's kind of self-sabotaging a little bit and then just gets too much like positive reinforcement from it. So he's like, I'm just actually going to kind of keep doing this thing.
Well, right. As soon as it feels like it's working, he just kind of leans into it. And even after getting beat up, he invites John to move in with him after he gets beat up by a patient's husband.
Yeah. And gets his best friend to defend his patient.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and I used the word enmeshed before, and in your notes I saw dual relationships, and I think there's just tons and tons and tons of examples of this as we get to know more and more of the characters of this show. So let's go into those characters and these relationships. So obviously we have Jimmy. We have Jimmy's daughter, Alice, who is 16, 17. She's like a junior in high school, feels like. And we have their next door neighbor, Liz, who's sort of like a surrogate mom for Alice and her husband. We have Brian, Jimmy's former best friend, who Jimmy reaches out to as he's sort of, trying to recover from, the first scene of the whole series where he's like drunk and or high in the pool with some women. He's basically recovering from that, right? From those life choices that he's been making. So he gets, reignites a connection with his friend. And then he has Gabby, his coworker and fellow therapist, played by Jessica Williams, who initially, along with Paul, their supervisor, just sort of seemed like colleagues. And then over the course of the next couple episodes, it's revealed how in depth all of these people are in each other's lives.
Yeah.
And there are tons of examples of that we can go through. But, before we talked about dual relationships, right? So this, even just talking about Jimmy and Gabby was Jimmy's wife, Tia's best friend. So not only is Gabby Jimmy's coworker, they're also very close friends. And later on in the season, more than that. Liz, as I said, surrogate mother to Jimmy's daughter, Alice, obviously is also a neighbor, becomes an investor in Jimmy's patient's Sean business that he wants to start.
And also becomes friends with Gabby.
and becomes friends with Gabby and becomes a person who has within the rock club that Liz has. And then we have Paul, played by Harrison Ford, the sort of disgruntled old senior wise therapist, right? Who we initially just kind of see as like, oh, he's the wise old mentor who's trying to keep his practice together and steer Jimmy and Gabby in the right directions as growing therapists. But then we come to see that he's sort of acting as Jimmy's daughter's therapist. I don't know how that started. It's not really identified, but we just sort of start to see them having these little kind of bench
lunches,
dates and lunch dates. And he very much acts as her therapist. I mean, in an episode later in this season, he doesn't identify her as a patient. He says like sort of like his daughter is in his house with him and she comes by. Yeah.
But then also Alice says like, I don't like therapy, and he goes, this isn't therapy.
Well, and good that he calls that out. But again, so I guess as you're observing all these dual relationships early on, and as a therapist yourself, how much was your like red light going off? Because I think for me, it was like, oh my gosh, like I think this was some of the most uncomfortable stuff for me in some of these early episodes. It was like, oh my gosh, everybody knows something about everyone, and everybody has a something that like a relationship, but then a side relationship where they also have a relationship with that person, but through this other side thing. And it was making me very uncomfortable. I don't know what you were observing from all of that.
Yeah. I think as soon as so we pick up pretty quickly, like the therapy of this is bad. Like, it's, for me, I was like, okay, great. I'm not going to be looking at this.
Of that.
Yeah, I'm not going to be looking at the therapy of this because nope. After that, to me, it feels like these people are just a group of friends who also happen to work together.
Yep.
And so to me, like the interconnectedness of it didn't feel that strange.
Okay.
Because like there's plenty of times where like say friend A and friend B do something that hurts friend C.
Yeah. Yep.
And then friend C and friend A talk it out. But then friend B is still like, on the trouble list, right?
Yeah.
And that sometimes is like, okay, well, the other two know what happened and they know how they figured it out, and they kind of stay out of it for the other. And like I think that really does happen in relationships,
but also like classic sitcom kind of problems, right?
Yeah. It's definitely like in sitcoms, you have a limited number of people, and so like if you're gonna have conflict between people, it's gonna have to be the same people. But also like in small groups of friends, that's what happens, right? Like this person is your ex's roommate, but they're also your friend. And so do you go snowboarding with him or do you not? Because, like that, it just happens like that, right? And I find most of their relationships pretty like wonderful. And I also like, I wish we could have had like a little bit more insight into how Alice and Paul's relationship did start. That would have been very intriguing. Because I think that they have a really lovely relationship. Like when, Liz was wonderful and stepped up in like the like day-to-day kind of care. But I think Paul really gave her this like connection to her dad when her dad wasn't able to connect, which I thought was really wonderful. And so it didn't really make me uncomfortable as much as it just was like, I mean, the Sean situation made me real uncomfortable.
Sure.
I was like, can you just, he's hurt, stop, patient.
Right.
But like if he had just been a dude that they had met who was renting the back house, I don't think I would have been as uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. And to your point here, I think it like all the relationships are presented in a way of like trying to make it that sort of like heartwarming sitcom,
Yeah.
like problem solving stuff. So
Mhm.
even though there's ethical things with Sean, it's still at the end of the day like, and we're gonna help him get a job, or and we're gonna
Mhm.
help reconnect him with his dad, or hey, why don't you come get ice cream with me? And it's like,
Uh-huh.
ha ha ha, yes, you live with your therapist, but like, and it just becomes less and less of a thing that's even acknowledged over the course
Yeah.
of the
Uh-huh.
season. Yeah, so all these very interesting relationships are going on, but with this backdrop of grief, and I thought we should at least acknowledge this a little bit.
Mhm.
Certainly for Jimmy, but also it's a major sort of plot point for Alice.
Yeah.
Her relationship with her dad, clearly sort of since her mom has passed away, has just become pretty distant. And we can
Yeah.
understand from that opening scene, like, your dad is not acting like your dad. He's
Mm-mm.
just sort of like in a hole, self-medicating and
Mhm.
getting through things
Yeah,
one day at a
disappearing.
time as
Yeah.
best he can. Yeah.
Mhm.
So what did you think about the portrayal of this sort of like family recovering from this grief, from this loss that they've experienced?
Yeah. What I do think is very interesting about this show is there is the like, hey, oh, grief has happened. The initial stages are gone. This is the like crawling your way out of it again. And not out of grief, but like back into life again.
Yeah.
Which I was trying to think like, could I pinpoint another show where that was the focus? Because
Hmm.
usually what happens is like the mother dies and then like they're dealing with their grief, right? Whereas this is like we actually didn't really see them deal with their grief,
Yep.
with their like immediate levels of grief, right? We saw them a
Mhm.
year later where they were starting to find their way back to normal life. And I actually really I don't like the phrase normal life, like back to like living again, right? Back
Yep.
to engaging in their lives again. What I really liked about that is to me it felt very realistic because Alice has wanted nothing more than this relationship with her father because like she says to him like you're acting like you're the only one who's grieving. I've been grieving too.
Yep.
And so then he like starts stepping up for her and then she's like it's not enough.
Yeah.
You don't get to just
You
like
can't come to one soccer match and feel
yeah.
like you fixed everything.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't like wash my jersey and be like, "Hey, I'm dad again."
Right, or make breakfast. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also, like, when she does go to connect with him again, but she doesn't communicate to him that she's gonna connect with him again, he misses it.
Yep.
And then she now has to deal with, like, "Okay, well, I was kind of putting myself out there, but he doesn't know that I was putting myself out there, but, like, now I
Mhm.
feel rejected, like, how do I
Yeah. They
manage
get a
it?"
lot of that back and forth.
Yeah, which can be really hard when you've broken communication with somebody, to have that vulnerable conversation again. And what I really loved was when Jimmy was talking to Paul, because Paul was basically like encouraging him, like, you got to keep showing up for your daughter, even if she's not prepared to accept it from you yet.
Mhm.
Jimmy goes, I'm losing faith in it working. And Paul goes, well, that makes sense because you've been trying it for almost a whole 10 minutes.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I laughed at that line because I have felt that in my own life, right? Like,
Mhm.
been like, well, I did this thing and it doesn't feel like it's working. But I also see it in my patients a lot where they're like,
Yeah.
I like tried the acceptance thing and it didn't go away. And you're like, okay, but that's not what acceptance is.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
that was really funny for me. But that was kind of a long answer to be like, I think they managed this process of rebuilding and reconnecting with life again in a really wonderful way. And then again, obviously, because there's such limited characters and things like that, it makes it when he falls into bed with somebody, it's his wife's best friend, and his daughter finds out, and like now they have to deal with that in a even more complicated way. And
Yep.
but those are things that are going to come up. Like, what's it like to forget your mom's birthday anniversary? What's it like
Mhm.
to see your dad dating again? What's it like to be the caretaker for a young lady for a year and now suddenly you're not needed anymore? Like, what's that like?
Yeah, and we see these sort of, as you said, these missed connections, right? They both clearly want this relationship to be, I don't even want to say back to normal, but back to, or I guess moving towards
Yeah.
something that feels better, something that feels new, something that feels like reconnected.
Yeah, back together.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it feels like in many ways, and I think this is true with a lot of people who are struggling with grief, that they're seeking out that thing that was the way it was when the person was still alive. Jimmy
Mhm.
talks about, um, with Alice, like, oh, we used to have these mornings and you'd come and you'd sit on the bed and we'd listen to music and you'd tell us a song and I'd tell you a song. And you'd tell me my songs are all too old.
Mhm.
And then they sort of try to recreate that, right? She comes in, and then that's when she realizes that she forgot the mom's birthday. And
Yeah.
that moment all of a sudden is broken. And I think that's such a well executed example of what grief is like,
Yeah.
which is we are trying to move on. And
Mhm.
then, oh no, that part of our dynamic that person is no longer a part of,
Mhm.
we're just reminded of it, right?
Mhm.
And now we're brought back into those feelings, and
Yeah.
that good energy and connection that we were building now all of a sudden is gone, and she walks out of the room, and
Mhm.
it's just heartbreaking seeing them almost kind of have that real close connection again.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the way Jimmy responded to that moment was really wonderful
Yeah.
because he just kind of explained like, well, I went, but I didn't want you to feel pressured to go. And so I, put it out there and it's okay. And like,
Mhm.
I do think he knows that his daughter's mother matters to her. So I do
Oh, yeah.
think like a conversation 4 days prior that would have been like, hey, your mom's birthday's coming up this week. I'm going to go give her flowers. Would you like to join or are you going to
Yes.
handle it yourself?
Sure.
That conversation, I think it would have been necessary of a little bit like give her the out of like,
Mhm.
if you don't want to do anything, if you don't want to think about it, don't.
Totally fine. Yep.
But just a heads up, something, it is coming. And I recognize it's coming and it's, probably going to be hard. But I think, like, since that didn't happen, his reaction and just kind of letting her be scared and hurt and
Mm.
frustrated about it, it didn't feel it didn't feel like a rupture between the 2 of them.
No, I
Like,
agree.
yeah,
Yeah.
it felt like the
Yeah.
first time where, like, they could both hold their grief in different ways together,
Mhm.
and she was upset with herself,
Yeah.
and he was hurt for her, and they
Mhm.
both had that moment. It does suck that it came, like, right after the, like, they were having a really nice
Yeah.
connection,
Yeah.
but it didn't feel like a rupture, it just felt like a different version of the connection that they were rebuilding.
Yeah. And that's why grief can be really complex for families as well, is because different relationships have been lost at the same time, right? So for Jimmy, part of him acknowledging to Alice that he's ready to move on is, I'm not wearing my wedding ring. I'm packing up her clothes.
Mhm.
And he does those things initially without telling her, to your point. So there's communication of this experience that's missing.
Yeah.
And that level of communication, that sort of open vulnerability, can prevent some of this, let's say, resentment, anger that Alice,
Conflict,
I think
yeah.
very understandably experiences,
Yep.
which is like, what do you mean you're getting rid of all mom stuff? Like,
Mhm.
what's going on? And then, he acknowledges and wants to give it to her, and then she kind of takes it on and tells stories. And that's where you really feel like, okay, this is what grief processing it looks like, is
Mhm.
Jimmy being able to walk out of the room and Alice being able to tell the story of,
The
her
shoes.
mom's shoes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then being able to wear them and just being able to
Yeah.
kind of take that on in a really positive way that she was excited about from
Yeah.
everything that we could see.
Yeah. And what I, didn't think about while I was watching it, but now as we were speaking, it occurred to me. We mentioned, like, in the first or second episode, she says to Jimmy Alice says to Jimmy, you keep acting like you're the only one grieving.
Yep.
And almost the way that he like took his wedding ring off, packed the stuff up, didn't tell her about the birthday. He was like, I'm handling, like, I'm moving forward,
Yep.
without recognizing that like the choices he makes about packing up his wife's clothes is also the choices he's making about packing up her mother's clothes.
Exactly right.
And
Yeah.
like taking off his wedding ring, what is it going to mean for her and her understanding of her parents, right? And yes, I do think that he gets to decide that he is ready to pack up the clothes and take off his wedding ring. Like he gets to
Of
determine that
course.
for himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he didn't recognize like she is going to be grieving these steps as well, and maybe not at the same time,
Right.
which falls into that line of her saying like, you're not recognizing that I'm also grieving.
Yeah.
And then obviously they're able to like come together better, where he's like, okay, what she needs is to talk about this. I don't necessarily want to or need to hear it.
Mm.
Why doesn't she tell Sean and I'll walk out the room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I don't remember exactly who says this, but I was looking up quotes, and I think this feels like a Paul line, but it was two vulnerable people will always find their way. Just stay connected, right? And I think that's what over the course of this season we see Jimmy and Alice kind of moving closer to, is them both being able to acknowledge what has been so difficult about this for each of them individually,
Mm-hmm.
and then moving on individually in their own ways while sort of sharing some of those experiences together.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really cool. Jimmy's sort of like attempts to be a dad again.
Mm-hmm.
So Alice steals the car and goes out to USC and
Mm-hmm.
goes to a guy's dorm and all these things. A very sort of stereotypical teenage rebellion
Mm-hmm.
thing. And Jimmy, along with Paul and Brian, great scene and great episode just in general,
Yeah.
really fun. But they track her down, bring her home, and he grounds her.
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction to that is basically like, sort of like, who are you? Who do you think you are? Can do this? Like, you haven't
Mm-hmm.
been dad.
Mm-hmm.
Mom would never do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think him recognizing that her sort of like belief or her desire to believe that, I
Mm-hmm.
think is sort of in line with her wanting, her own version or her own memory of mom
Mm-hmm.
as being like separate from what her dad is doing in that moment. Right.
Yeah.
And then for him to be able to say, like, she would, like,
Yeah.
we
Uh-huh.
would both discipline you. Like, we're both parents that care about your behavior, and what you did wasn't okay.
Yeah. And she also was like reacting to a year of not being disciplined for anything. Now, it doesn't
Exactly.
seem like she really did anything that needed disciplining throughout that year,
Right.
but but Paul says like he's not going to do anything. He never does anything, right? And
Yes, she does.
and then when she says like mom wouldn't do that, probably part of her grief process is remembering how much she like loves her mom and like how
Yeah.
like
And the
right the
comfort.
stealing the ice
Yes.
cream, right? Like stuff
Yes.
like
Yeah,
that.
100%.
And
Yep.
so in that moment she probably was like, mom was great and you suck. And he's
Mom
like, no,
took my
sometimes
side.
mom sucked too,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And when he says that, she like looked at him and she was like, yeah, mom would have done this,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yep.
it almost like reinforced like that this is an okay thing for him to do,
Yeah.
which was a nice parent child connection moment if it
Yeah.
wasn't a nice like intimate moment,
Right. Yep.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I wanted to maybe pause, and we don't have to record this, but I was going to sort of all these other relationship dynamics that this show goes through in one 10-episode season. Like, what other relationships jump out to you that you'd like to kind of talk through with our time today?
Yeah. Well, I think we should chat briefly about that conversation between Jimmy and Brian where Jimmy gets quote unquote into it with Brian a little bit at pickleball, and basically they have this discussion about how like you wouldn't let me be miserable. Like you
Yes.
kept on trying to like, everything goes my way and everything's great and you're fine. Let's
Mm-hmm.
move on.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that some people do when their friends, their loved ones are uncomfortable, I try to be like, just focus on having fun, just move forward. Like, that's unhealthy for you. Don't do that. As opposed to like, if you need to scroll through your ex's Instagram a couple times a week, like just do that.
Yeah.
Like if it becomes an obsession, then let's talk about it. But like if that's what you need to kind of move through this, be a little miserable if you need
Yeah.
to, and I thought that was like a really powerful conversation. And then it ended with a joke, which I also thought was like good.
Yes.
That's also what friendship is about, is like
Mm-hmm.
I can make a joke about this without it actually undermining the message or without it being awful.
Well, yeah, but I think this is what grief does to friendships, right? So we went through
Mhm.
sort of the experience that Jimmy and Alice's relationship changed and evolved and was affected by their loss, but the effect on Jimmy and his friendships and other relationships was obviously deeply, deeply affected as well.
Mhm.
So his friend Brian, this sort of ever the optimist or ever the sort of positive person,
Mhm.
that just it was an energy that Jimmy couldn't really handle.
Mhm.
And, wanting it to be okay to be sad and to
Mhm.
not be, the person that was going to kind of show up to pickleball or show up
Uh-huh.
to weekly hikes in the same way that he used to, didn't feel okay. So all of a sudden he stopped reaching out or stopped showing up.
Mhm.
And I think this is super common with people who are struggling, not just with grief, but depression, anxiety, all sorts of things
Mhm.
where this sort of misalignment of almost like emotional energy of like,
Mhm.
oh, well, I usually go out and see my friends for brunch, or we,
Mhm.
we do this, or we go here, or we're on this team, or we,
Mhm.
check in this often. If the sort of alignment becomes off, it can
Mhm.
be really hard to reignite that, rekindle
Yeah.
that, even when you're doing better.
Yeah. And I think that like also sometimes people kind of err into like a one or the other, right? So like
Hmm.
either we go play pickleball and we pretend like nothing's happened, or we
Yeah.
like sit on the couch and we cry about it. And I think what most people need is like the invitation to pickleball with the option to be miserable while you're there,
Love that. Yeah. Hmm.
or the invitation to pickleball with the option to say like not today but maybe tomorrow,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And I think that that's people sometimes struggle with that because they like want to give the person like what they need. So then if I say like no, I don't want to go to pickleball, then they go like okay, well, I'll just leave her alone. And
Right.
I also don't want to be alone. Right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and being really like flexible, and
Hmm.
instead of trying to figure out what it is that they need, giving them the option to be just what they are, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, we're going to pickleball. I'd love you to come. I know you're feeling miserable. If you'd like to come, we'd love to have you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it seems like Brian has some of his own like anxiety stuff and tries to control everything. And when you can't control your best friend's grief, it probably it clearly caused a great rift between the two of them.
Yeah. And that's where we see over the course of the rest of the season that relationship kind of returning to some of those roots where they're able to, wrestle with how honest to be with each other, right?
Hmm.
So Jimmy kind of botches the whole ornate proposal
Understatement.
circumstance, yes, by overindulging and vomiting and making other poor choices that particular party night. And then as a result, Brian is sort of like, I don't know if we're comfortable having you as the officiant to the wedding.
Hmm.
And that conversation where it's okay that Jimmy's hurt by that,
Hmm.
and Paul sort of helps them navigate some of that friendship stuff.
Uh-huh.
And then, sort of subsequently, as they work that out, the sort of mini theme of that was Jimmy instructing one of his patients to boop her husband, who, of
Uh-huh.
course, she went back to.
Yeah, let's talk about the booping.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the booping because I think it's an interesting sort of concept in the realm of like breaking patterns, because that's how it
Uh-huh.
is sort of addressed in Jimmy and Brian's relationship, which is
Yep.
that, you know, uh, Jimmy's just supposed to let it go and everything's going to be okay. And actually, no, it's okay that Jimmy's upset.
Mhm.
and that Brian hurt his feelings, and Jimmy's actually going to say, no, I think you need to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, sort of like interrupted the pattern of how they would usually resolve some of these, or let's say not resolve some of these, friendship tension moments.
Yeah. What I really liked it was sometimes all you need to do is break the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And like that whole episode, I think this all happened in the same episode, but like there were multiple different versions of like booping, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Alice gets grounded.
Yes.
Like their pattern for so long has just been like him kind of letting her get away with whatever, and he is like, nope, we're changing this pattern, and then I don't remember specifically what Grace does. I think she just says no to her husband.
Other than pushing him off the cliff, booping him off the
That's
cliff.
the ultimate boop. Oh my goodness. What a like you made this joke before we started, but
Yeah.
that's a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
But truly, like sometimes I say to my patients, if you're feeling stuck, do something different. So I said,
Yep.
like, if you're feeling stuck, drive to work a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And like that seems so wild. Like rearrange your living room.
Mm-hmm.
Get a haircut. If you
Yeah.
and your wife always have dinner at home, order in or go out, right? Just once.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be
Yep.
every week. You don't have to like change like a whole, but like just shake it up a little bit, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
if you guys always fight over the dishwasher, as soon as you guys start fighting over the dishwasher, be like, okay, fine, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take out all the plates and we're going to hand wash every single one of them. And then we'll start again tomorrow. Like just break the pattern.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And truly, I think the power of that is so incredible because our brains kind of get caught up in these ideas where like, oh, because it's been going this way, it has to keep going this way.
Yeah.
Particularly in relationships, people kind of get like, oh, well, she and I have been fighting a lot, or we never go out anymore, or we never do things, and then people feel like, oh, well, this is how it's always going to be. And it's like, if you can just convince yourself to change the smallest thing, it will change the whole relationship. And we see that with Derek and Liz, where he goes, I love you. It's your turn to figure out something outside the house. It's my turn to be home, right? And he kind of boops her there a little bit of like, I've always 100%. Fit in with you. It's your turn to fit in with me a little bit. And I think that's wonderful. I really love the booping.
Yeah, because I think that's presented as like another example of Jimmy like going rogue.
Mm-hmm.
But I think realistically, like there is a perfectly appropriate and like clinically supported, way to sort of incorporate that sort of skill, right? Dynamic shift. And
like
we do.
Yeah. And even like therapists could do it, right? So like
absolutely.
If you're feeling stuck with a patient and you're like, I feel like I am pulling teeth with this person. Like if you're in an in-person therapy room, you sit in the therapy chair and have them sit in I guess that happened in treatment. Like, didn't she switch spots with
she did.
one of the guys? Yeah.
Yeah.
So like something like that, something as simple as that can like really shake up a pattern and shake up a relationship in a way that can cause change, which is fun. Yeah.
So one of the other sort of relationship dynamics that I wanted to talk about is Paul. Paul and everybody.
Paul's the best.
I love Harrison Ford in this. I wasn't sure, because some of the previews just made him seem like a grump. And
he is a grump.
He is a grump. But he's a human grump. He is a human
wonderful
that has some real stuff of his own going on, and that's impacting his relationships, and that he's figuring stuff out too. And I think that role specifically of therapist supervisor, I think, is one that most people don't get to see this relationship, which is, Jimmy, Paul is someone that he idolizes and looks up to and wants a human connection with, right? Wants a hug from.
Yep.
And for Gabby, and they acknowledge this in the later episodes as she's looking for a professorship, she wants that kind of connection that he has with Jimmy, which is like, I want to talk about clinical interactions. I want to feel like I have earned your professional respect, right? That I'm not just
Mhm.
a person that gave you a water bottle and drives you to work. I'm also like a colleague that you hold in high esteem.
Yeah, she
And
just wants
I
acknowledgement from him.
yes, and I really enjoyed the window into that, because I think it's something that, much like any sort of workplace show, especially a
Mhm.
workplace comedy, it's like, oh, yeah, we don't know that this is something that therapists do, if you
Mhm.
don't hear about it, right, from a
Mhm.
therapist.
Yeah. What is fun about, like, what the relationships that we get to see between them, I think the office relationship is very indicative of, like, a group practice
Yes.
kind of thing. The difference is, I think their relationships are very like, friends more than coworkers,
100%. Yeah.
other than Paul, obviously, right?
Mhm.
But it just makes it more, like, interconnected than, like, I think some group practices are. But for Paul, like, I like the moment when Jimmy had to point out to him, like, she's she's treating you better than I am. Like, but you're yet here
Yeah.
you are giving me all this attention. And
Mhm.
also they've gotten to like they've moved from like supervisor role to like mentorship role of like, I just need somebody to bounce something off of. And I have an old supervisor that I used to work with, and he and I meet like twice a year, just kind of to
Nice.
like chat.
Yeah.
And it's my favorite. He's my
Yeah.
favorite.
Mhm.
And it's like, I think it's nice, but then with Paul being such a grump, like, I think it adds an extra dynamic to it where they don't get that, like, they don't get to feel endeared either by
Mm.
him or to him because he has such, like, intense boundaries with them.
Yep.
But we see him do it with Alice, right?
Yes.
Like, when
Yes.
they share the chicken at his house and
Mhm.
he, like, kind of lets her in but kind of doesn't, and so we
Mhm.
know he's capable of it, and so there's, like, a lot of growth that can happen there next season. And he's afraid. He's got a new diagnosis.
Well, right. So that's like a whole subplot on its own, right? Is yes, he's a wizened older therapist, but he's at a point in his career where he's being acknowledged for like career achievements, and he sort
Mhm.
of acknowledges like, I'm not done.
Mhm.
Like, but at the same time, he has his daughter asking him to basically leave his life there and
Mhm.
come live with them because of his
Mhm.
Parkinson's. And meanwhile he's like, no, actually, I'm trying to cultivate this relationship, and I still really want to work, and I have relationships here that I really care about.
Yeah.
So those are like real legit, work life balance
Mhm.
challenges that I think
Yep.
are really interesting portrayed here.
Yeah. Ryan, tell them how you felt about him not going to Vegas, but going to the family play.
Okay, so this is going to be a broader conversation here, because this show, I think, I don't know, like I said up front, was like made in a lab to cause me to have feelings, but honestly, so even from, I don't know if you recognize the theme song, the central theme.
Mm-mm.
Do you know the lyrics?
I don't think so. I do
Okay, so I'm
remember being
gonna
like, "This sounds nice."
it is nice. So it's Ben Gibbard and someone
Mm.
else, and Ben
Mhm.
Gibbard, of course, Death Cab for Cutie,
Mhm.
which, for me, high school and college was like
Yep.
my jam.
Uh-huh, same.
So having that voice and this kind of music set up this
Mhm.
show, it's just like, oh man, it's like settling into your couch with a warm blanket.
Uh-huh.
So I'm just like, I'm in that mindset where, if they hit on something really well, which in many cases they did,
Mhm.
I was right there kind of ready to feel all my feelings. And that episode in particular, where Paul is sort of wrestling with, okay, yeah, I got this, this acknowledgement from the APA, and they want to give me an award in Vegas, and who do I bring to Vegas? And I talk through all the characters in the show, and maybe I want to bring my new doctor slash girlfriend, another dual relationship.
I know. Jeez Louise.
And he's sort of getting advice from Jimmy on trying to reconnect with his daughter, and then the sort of like, and I was not prepared. I was like, okay, he's taking the girlfriend to Vegas. Like, sure,
Yeah.
great. What a
Like, that
nice
was
relationship
nice.
to
Yeah.
cultivate. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then they go to the grandson's play that his daughter said that they couldn't come to Vegas because the grandson had a play. So he takes the girlfriend not to Vegas to get the award, but instead they go across the country to, his grandson's play. And as soon as I realized that that's where they were, because they do this like misdirect where you think they're just like outside of a hotel in Vegas, and all of a sudden
Mhm.
they're walking into like a community theater.
Mhm.
Man, Hayley, they got me. I was not prepared
Yay.
for that. It really like a jolt.
It feels.
Yeah, a jolt of feels.
What was funny for
Yeah.
me was, so they walk into an auditorium, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they had to like be like, "Excuse me, are those seats taken?" And I was like, "He's the guest of honor. He wouldn't
Yeah,
have to
really?
like,
Yeah,
yeah, he wouldn't
yes.
have to shuffle past people. He would be seated up front."
So
And so I was
your
like,
alarm bells were going off.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, I just was like, "This is weird."
Yeah.
And then I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm dumb." Like, I didn't catch on to what was happening here. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and just the look on the daughter's face of just like pure love. I like that's not the
Shock,
right word.
gratitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was yeah,
It was
yeah.
like it was surprise, but it wasn't just like, "Oh," it was like this like melting,
Yes.
and
Well, he chose her, and he
yeah.
chose that relationship to prioritize after her, I think, justifiably so, like, telling him that he's never prioritized this relationship. He's
Yeah.
never invested in this relationship. And
Mhm.
he sort of warns him, she sort of warns him, like, are you going to go your whole life and never like try to address this?
Yeah.
And he does, and he
Mhm.
is.
Yeah.
And wow.
And it
Yeah.
kind of it's interesting how he helps Alice and Jimmy kind of rekindle, because he struggles to do that with his own daughter,
Yep.
right? And I think that's a
Mhm.
perfect example of how therapists are sometimes good at teaching stuff that they're not good at doing.
Mhm.
And the way, like, remember, he like invites her to Vegas, but then it is, as Alice would have said, like, it's not enough because it's actually a work event, right? and
Mhm.
and so for him to then be like, oh, okay, well then let me readjust, let me try again,
Yeah.
really mirrors that from the beginning of the season as well, and it was very sweet.
Yeah. So the theme song is called Frightening Fishes.
That sounds like a postal service slash
I
death cab
know.
song.
Yes. Yes. But the lyrics are really nice. So, help me carry this weight that's dragging me down. Pull me out of the drink before I start to drown. Let the wreckage all sink to where the fishes are frightening. I want to hear myself think again. I want to hear myself think again. So it goes through
That's
that,
nice.
but that's like the main like part that hits you as the title
Yeah.
card is
I
showing.
noticed the
Yeah.
song and I liked it every time
Yeah.
it played, but it makes sense now that you tell me that
Yeah.
it
Well,
is.
I think, and obviously Scrubs was a very different show, but similarly had these very emotionally impactful moments.
Mhm.
And yeah, I obviously it's only 10 episodes. It wasn't like a classic sitcom, it was much more like a comedy drama.
Mhm.
But I'm personally really excited for season 2. I mean, we didn't even talk about Jimmy and Gabby's relationship,
Yeah.
situationship.
I actually think it's a really healthy one. My only bummer with
Yeah,
it is I wish that shows would start showing sexual relationships that don't have to be romantic, that can be
sure.
healthy and
Mm-hmm.
mature and intimate and like connected without them having to be like,
Doesn't have to be anything
well, and now
else.
Gabby's falling in love with him.
Right, right.
But
He's no longer safe.
yeah,
Yes,
but like
yes.
that's not as fun of a
But like you
story.
said, it's if they're going to be relationships, it has to be all within this one small
There's
group
gotta
of
be
people.
conflict. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Will they? Won't
So
they? Yeah. So more to come on that. But the one question I wanted to ask you before we kind of get to reviews here is, you acknowledge up front, because you're still fully virtual, right?
yep. Yes, I am.
So this is a show that feels like to me it's happening in a world either that COVID never existed or is just like fully post COVID.
Post-COVID, yeah, because he does do some virtual with, his with Grace.
But she's out of country.
Yeah, she's in Canada, which also
Yeah,
is
yeah.
not
So
totally
it's like very
legal.
specific circumstances that he is does that with her. So again, like at this moment, this show really got me in my feels, and it
Mhm,
did make me miss a lot of in person stuff. Both being in an office with colleagues and group
mhm.
practice stuff, as well as seeing people in person and like that experiential stuff, which I think can be so powerful. So I was gonna ask you, like, did any part of you, in watching this have that sort of like flashback to, I'm sure, in your own, time when you've had different work circumstances as well?
Did you ask me a question because my cat pulled my headphones
Oh,
out?
I'm sorry. Cats, mine's on my lap being very respectful.
Mine is not.
I do think virtual therapy is equivalent in a lot of ways, but obviously I
Mhm.
can't take people to
Yeah,
scatter their parents' ashes, and
yeah.
and not that I was doing that before, but you like to think you could go on a walk with somebody if you really needed to.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, so I guess, what was that like for you? Yeah.
I kinda got the same feeling as well. I like doing virtual because of, the flexibility of
Oh
it
yeah, so
and,
many
like
benefits
yeah.
of it. Yeah.
However, there are, like, small moments where I'm like, I wish I had a whiteboard between me and my patient that I could draw on
Yeah.
to explain what I'm talking about. Or I do this like values card sort, and I used to do it in the room with the patient, and now I
Sure.
send it to them and have them do it, and then we talk about it the next week.
Yep.
And I, yeah, worked in a lot of like hospitals or like schools or things like that where I got to like
Mhm.
play basketball with the kids while we
Yeah,
talked or
totally.
things like that.
Yeah.
And I do love that because I do think it allows for a little bit more like flexibility and creativity. I find strict talk therapy a little limiting in that like there's only certain people who it can work for.
Mhm.
Right? Like I had
Yep.
one teenager that we would just draw every
Yeah.
time. And so now like one of my teenagers one day she was like, this is like a lot for me." And I was like, "Get a coloring book. Like
Yeah.
color while we
Just
talk."
do
And
something
yeah,
else.
and
Yeah.
she's like doing better now, but like normally
Nice.
in my office I would like do it with
Yeah.
them, right?
You'd boop them out. Yep.
Yeah. So that I do miss. I did enjoy like the camaraderie of working in a program or a hospital or things like
Mhm.
that. When I started my private practice, I was in an office with 4 other therapists, and I think we would have formed like quite a nice like working relationship space.
Mhm.
I rented that office at the end of 2019 and used it barely at all and then eventually just gave it up. And so I never
Yeah.
kind of got the like private practice group space
Yeah.
experience. But the way that they sit in the kitchen and like talk and like,
Yeah.
give each other potatoes and like
Yeah.
stuff
Yeah.
like I do miss that. Like
Yeah.
I do think I would like that. And your experience and my experience are also different because you
Mhm.
have coworkers. I don't.
Technically, yes, I
Yeah.
do. I
So,
do.
like,
Yeah.
occasionally you're like, I had a meeting with
Yeah.
somebody, or I'm
Yeah.
like, whereas like me, I'm like, just me
Yeah.
in my office with my
Yeah.
patients,
Mhm.
which was its own experience during
Of
COVID, right?
course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I think I also kind of miss that a little bit. And would I make explicit changes now to get back to it? Like right now, the benefits outweigh the
Oh, yeah.
downfall.
Same.
Um,
Yeah.
but if I ever got like, if anything ever forced me back to it, I wouldn't be upset about it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I just kinda noticed myself watching that, like, just it feeling so jarring from everything that's happened in, like, the
Mm,
therapy world for the past
yeah.
couple of years,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a fun little family of a show, so perhaps we should, acknowledge that we're not gonna get into every little micro, plot twist and do some reviews.
Yeah.
I'll start with you in terms of accuracy, because I do think, we acknowledged up front, obviously, this show is about therapists and we do
Mhm.
see some therapy. So, how accurate did you feel like shrinking was on a scale of 1 to 5 delicately tumbled rocks that you would give to a friend? How accurate did you find shrinking in terms
Yeah.
of this sort of multifaceted
parts of
ways
it.
it addressed
Yeah.
mental health
Yeah.
issues. Yeah.
I knew you were going to pick that one, so I've already picked a different one.
Okay, good.
We've already kind of discussed that, like, the therapy itself, bad. So I'm
Yep.
like, I'm not even going to address that. I'm going to look more towards like mental health of recovery from grief, reforming relationships after grief. One thing that I do want to say is I can't remember too many explicit examples of Gabby doing therapy, but there was one interaction with a therapist or with a patient where the patient was like, I like when you swear. And she's like, I know, that's why I effing do it.
Yeah.
And that interaction to me felt like good therapy.
At
I was like,
100%.
oh, I
Yes.
was like, maybe
Yes.
Gabby's a good therapist. We just never got to
Mm-hmm.
see it.
Yeah.
Also, I think Gabby's the best. I think she's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like people moving through grief and moving back into like relationships after grief and reforming relationships, this is like 4.5 tumbled and polished rocks, like maybe even 5, like because they're not done perfectly.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, like I think as soon as you make it comedy, it becomes a little bit silly, and there, it makes it that sometimes there's like a joke instead of like the way something would really happen or things like that. And
yeah,
I think there are moments where like Alice is surprisingly chill about stuff that I think she would like struggle with a little bit more.
Sure.
But also she does seem like a well-adjusted child, and so like maybe that would be accurate. So there's not enough to sell me that it's like a bad representation.
Right.
So I'm gonna say like 4.5 plus
nice
tumbled rocks. Yeah, I think they did a really good job of like the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree?
I do. Yeah, it's sort of like what you said, the sort of messiness of it is well represented, that it's sort of we're sort of putting the therapy itself to the side and just acknowledging that the people and the sort of relationships in and around the actual therapy that happened were just felt really well rounded and really well portrayed and emotionally sort of in line with what I think you and I would expect based on the different circumstances going on. So
yeah, I agree.
yeah.
Awesome.
All right. So before you ask me, we're going to do our favorite challenge in which you guess the tomato meter or audience score for Shrinking.
96.
Okay. So not as close as usual. It has an audience score of 86%.
Oh, I was going to say 88 originally, but I was like, it's so good.
It is really, and the tomato meter, which is all the critics, is 81%. So certified fresh. But yeah, just like a solid, I guess, what's that, like a solid B, I guess? Yeah.
That's funny. So I said what, like I said 4.5, so that would have been a 90. But yeah, I was originally going to say 88, which is funny. But yeah, I mean, I am kind of surprised. I am a little surprised that it's quote unquote that low, because I don't know, I'll ask you about entertaining and maybe you can give me some insight. But I just was like, I laughed out loud a few times. And so I thought it was very well put together. But, I think when you want everything to be as good as Ted Lasso, other things just sometimes don't measure up.
That's true. Hard to get there.
Okay. So since we're talking about how entertaining it is.
Yes.
On a scale from 0 to 5 gallon-sized water bottles that Gabby lugs around, or their miniature version that she gives to Paul.
Yeah.
How entertaining did you think this was?
Yeah, so for me, we talked about how sort of our different experiences of it in terms of the arc of the season. For me, I thought it got better because I think I watched the first episode and was so worried about what the therapy portrayal was going to be the rest of the season that I was like, oh man, I don't know if I'm able to watch this. Obviously, I was going to be able to, but I just wasn't sure how much I was going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Versus sort of be cringed by it. but the turn that they took to really make it about this family of people and
Yeah.
how they're coping with a very real loss in such heartwarming and funny. I laughed, I think, more as the episodes went on, especially with like, Paul getting weed gummies and the Brian relationship evolving. I just found myself enjoying more and more of it. I zoomed through the last 4 episodes. I think I binged it because I was just like in such a good place with it. So for me, oh my gosh, am I giving this a 5? I'm just sort of like discovering it as I'm talking about it. Okay, so I think to answer your question, I think the reason that it doesn't get a 5 is this initial stuff that we see. One of the reviews that I saw felt like it was, Jason Segel in any other role you've seen him in any other movie. He's Jason Segel, and like some of that's funny, some of it's just like big goofy naked baby jokes that doesn't necessarily quite connect the same way it does when I think he's really having emotional connected moments with Alice or Brian or Paul. That's why I think we really get a better version of this show and a better version of Jimmy the character. So that's why for me, I'm just going to give a really nice 4.75.
Okay. I mean, I feel like you and I kind of had the same reaction for both the ratings, where we were like, it's not a 5, but it's also not a 4.5, so it's a 4.5 plus a little bit. Yeah.
Yep.
What I do think is interesting is, so you kind of mentioned we had reverse arc, you liked it more as it went on. I liked it a lot more in the beginning. And what you spoke to is you really loved the focus of the like emotional, intimate connections between them, which I also really enjoyed.
Yeah.
But what I really liked about it at the beginning was that it was just joke after joke after joke after joke.
It was joke heavy. That's true.
Yeah. So I think, as it moved more into like the intimacy and the connection, you enjoyed it more. And I loved it when it was just like so silly.
Yeah. Sure.
And just like
Fair.
these wisecracks. And
yeah.
And I think both of those things is what makes it so great. So
yeah. So looking forward to season 2 whenever we end up getting that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that is our episode for today. That was Shrinking on Apple TV. So thank you for following along and listening. Hayley, our listeners can now like send us comments and questions and stuff on Spotify. So if you want to, if you happen to listen on Spotify and see those options and you want to shoot us a question or a comment, there's like a really easy way to do that now. So feel free to do so. Otherwise, you can find us on all our other social medias at PopPsych101. Thank you as always for listening.
Bye.
Bye.